Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining this session this morning to discuss what donors can do to support a more effective and efficient humanitarian supply chain. Before we start, some housekeeping. We will hear from the panelists in a moment, and while they intervene, you have the opportunity to provide some inputs or questions through the Slido. There is also, I think, an internet connection for those of you who may wish to avail that. And there is the translation headsets with English on the channel number 1, French number 2, and Spanish number 3. So after the panelists have addressed some of the questions that we have for them, we will take some questions from the floor, and we will look at the questions on the Slido to be able to also take some of the questions of the colleagues that are online connected to this session. The session will last about an hour and 15 minutes. So without further ado, my name is Maëlyn Fauchon, and I will be moderating this session as the Global Logistics Cluster Coordinator. It's an honor for me to be here today and to address what is, for me, a critical issue that impacts the delivery of humanitarian assistance. For those who may not be familiar with the logistics cluster, it is a coordination mechanism that was established in 2005 by the Interagency Standing Committee. And it supports humanitarian actors to alleviate the logistics constraints or bottlenecks that are impeding the delivery of aid. Concretely, it does so through coordination of all the actors, the humanitarian actors, the donors, the local governments, the communities, the national partners. But it also does so by providing and sharing information so that partners can make informed decisions about how they're going to respond. And it also facilitates access to logistic services, either by ensuring that partners can connect to each other, or if all the national capacities are overwhelmed, or if the scale of the response is such that partners cannot respond, then WFP, as the World Food Programme, as the lead agency of the logistics cluster, may be called upon to provide logistics services as a provider of last resort for the entire community. Now, yesterday we've heard many discussions around the challenges of the past few years and those coming ahead, the ever-increasing needs, how the humanitarian assistance should not further impact the environment, how we deal with the ripple effects of COVID, of the war in Ukraine, the climate change, the worsening of the food security worldwide, and the need for flexible funding. Now, is it still worth highlighting that supply chain plays a critical role in the delivery of aid? 1 year after the launch of the EU policy setting out its vision for paradigm change in humanitarian logistics towards a more efficient, effective, and greener delivery of aid, why is it still so common for logisticians not to be involved in programmatic planning at the beginning of the chain and to be left with the daunting task of having to ensure that the assistance reaches those in need? I can still hear my colleagues in Burkina, in Mali, in Nigeria, in Haiti, in the program teams telling me, don't worry, the logis will take care of it. They'll make it happen. So it's all on the logistician down the line, but how do we make sure that they are involved at the beginning of the planning? And it's also a matter of cost. We know that supply chain accounts for a bit more than 70% of humanitarian response costs. So how are we collectively going to optimize our operations to be able to reduce those costs and help more people with less or the same amount of resources that we have? And last but not least, if we are to reduce the carbon footprints and the environmental impact of the delivery of aid, why are we not investing more in greening the supply chain? So these are all a number of questions that we need to keep in mind as we go through our conversation today. I'm excited to hear from the distinguished panelists that are here today. and to engage with all of you through the questions towards the end of the session. So we have with us today Cécile Terraz, who's the Supply Chain Director at Plan International. Cécile is also a founding member of the Hulot Coopérative. And she has actually a dual background because she did half of her career in the private sector, but now also in the humanitarian sector. We have Margot Panigali, who heads the Capacity and Operational Support unit at DG ECHO. His unit deals, amongst other, with the EU logistics policy, the European Humanitarian Response Capacity, for those who are familiar with it, the EHRC, but also the implementation of the RescEU initiatives, and I guess he will talk to us about that a bit later. We also have Pierre Salignon, who heads, I don't know if my English translation of the Centre de Crise will be the correct one, but who has the Humanitarian Stabilization Operations Center at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But prior to his career as a diplomat, Pierre has been involved for 3 decades, I believe, in humanitarian assistance, being the Director General of 2 NGOs, but also working with WHO and the Agence Française de Développement. And last but not least, we have Nadia Griffin, who is the team leader for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Supply Chain Management Division of the Bureau of Humanitarian Aid, USAID. And Nadia has been working for nearly 20 years in managing logistics operations, including, prior to BHA, also with several INGOs. So thank you very much for joining. Let's dive into the discussion. I have a few questions for you, and I'll start with you, Cécile. So from a humanitarian practitioner perspective, from the NGO side, why do you think that donors should invest in supply chain? And can you give us a few examples of challenges that the community has seen, maybe even some thoughts about how to address those?
Thank you, Mylene, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many people interested to talk about supply chain. So the first question I had is, why should donor really be interested in supply chain? And when we look at the 2021 annual report for 30 of the biggest NGO players, this was a revenue of 17 billion. So empirically, you can say 8.5 billion was spent in supply chain for 1 year in 2021. This is huge. So if you tell that to a CEO, that 50% of your spend is through supply chain, definitely you have a point of interest. So as a donor as well, 50% of your grant investment is invested in supply chain. Also, as I said, supply chain, is the backbone of operations. As Mylene said, 70% in emergency, it's up to 80% of the spend in emergency is in the supply chain. But also, I often say supply chain is power. So it's not only from the people we buy from, it's not only the people we buy for, but it's people we buy from. In the local economy, we make an impact. Where do we buy from? Where do we invest our money? We buy to deliver work, services, and items for people, but where we buy this product from make an impact. And for us as humanitarian, boosting the local economy is absolutely critical. And you can push that even further, saying, why not looking at gender-responsive procurement? Where are the women-owned business in the market where we work? Why not investing in this women-owned business? So there is what I call the double impact. You buy things for people in need, but also you buy from people that give them an income in the local economy. And finally, supply chain guarantee access to the most vulnerable population. People otherwise that will not be reached. So that's a few points why I think donors should invest in supply chain. Now, I think if you look at the past years, NGOs have made tremendous effort to work better together. There are so many initiatives to try to be more efficient, to be more effective. We have realized over time, that sometimes NGOs, they compete on some challenging point, like human resources. Or NGOs sometimes might compete for funding, right? But there are parts of our work where we don't need to compete it's the supply chain. And this is this idea where we recognize we are competing on some aspects, that's healthy. We can collaborate on other aspects, the co-opetition. We compete and collaborate on the supply chain. And one of these initiatives that was born over the last few years is what Mylene mentioned, ULO, the first humanitarian cooperative connecting actors and pooling resources to optimize logistics and supply chain. And actually, ULO was funded by everyone on this stage this morning. But this idea of ULO is to give an equal space to everyone, putting our supply chain together. You know, in the past, NGOs do work together, but it was very much based on relationship. When you are somewhere, who do you know? But creating a legal structure allows everyone to have access to the same resource and share their supply chain. And ULO is already operating in several countries, trying to have joint procurement, joint human resources, joint transport, joint warehouses, and much more. And this is a revolution. This is a new way of working. And I'm pretty convinced in the future that will grow and create more efficiency, effectiveness that we are looking from this 8.5 billion spent in supply chain. Now, every revolution creates pain points. Changes create pain points. And I've been asked to give two very concrete examples of what are these pain points this morning, and that's what I would like to bring to you. One concrete example, it's very logistic now, is the medical supply chain. So, as you know, medical supply chain is very complicated. It's a tense market. Timelines are very long. There are just a few suppliers. We are small clients. Import rules are complicated. Very hard to deliver medical supply chain. But on top of that, every donor has different rules about how we should do medical supply chain, especially pre-qualified supplier, end of contract constraints, you know. So on top of having a complexity on the market for medical supply chain, we have a donor complexity of having to work differently with every donor. So the first question from me this morning is how could we harmonize donor rules on this specific case? Because we are all having a common objective of quality and value for money, so we can work better together. Second pain point, grant. So as you know, humanitarian needs are growing and funding are decreasing. And today, on the grant, we are penalized if we make savings. So with ULO, concretely, we have found a way to make savings on the grant. But we can't do anything with these savings because it's called underspend, and then NGOs are penalized because it affects their indirect cost allocation. So we are saying we can do savings, but we don't know what to do with these savings, and there is no incentive because no one wants to be underspent on a grant on the NGO side. So the second question from me is, why can't donor give flexibility to NGO to reuse these savings into transformative supply chain, for example? We did a little study last month with ULO across NGO about IT system. It's a big question, right? Having supply chain software. 75% of the NGOs saying they were not satisfied with their current system or not having a system. And we know that digitalization is the future. Data, transparency, accountability. So why not reinvesting these savings, for example, into IT system, but giving the freedom to NGO to reinvest? And the beauty of it is it doesn't cost more money. It's just a different use of the existing money. So that's it. I think for me, I brought my 2 points and this revolution of shared services, and I brought my 2 questions.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll get back to some of your questions as we continue the conversation. But jumping on a point that you made on the requirement for the entire humanitarian community to do better. Over the past 20 years, and I'll ask you that question, Marco, about over the past 20 years, so we've been asked to take steps to collaborate, to provide collective responses, to pool our resources, to invest our own funds in transformative supply chain, to harmonize our own requirements, to harmonize our own reporting way and so on. And the humanitarian community has advocated for also greater transparency in the sector. So from ECHO's perspective, how's the donor community doing to coordinate and harmonize their own investments in humanitarian logistics? And can you provide us a few concrete examples of what collectively donors could do more of or less of moving forward?
Thank you very much, Mylene. Good morning, everybody. So it is also for me a pleasure to be here in this panel with some distinguished speakers. I hear what you say, of course. And by the way, in your introduction, you said half of what I was about to say about logistics. That will spare some time. No, I'm just joking. So this is the second time that we are here. So in the forum to talk about logistics. The first time was last year when the new logistics policy launched by ECHO, by the European Commission, was discussed in a very interesting panel, and hopefully next year we'll be again talking about logistics, but with the improvements, all the successes, hopefully, that we have been achieved together collectively in this area. So why is this logistic important? Why should the donors be more coordinated among them? So there is the evidence, as Cecile has already explained, very clearly pointing out the inefficiencies of logistics, not only in terms of costs, but also in terms of not being very active in terms of more greening, for instance. So logistics is not only bringing stuff from A to B. Logistics is the full system which should be made more efficient, effective, and also more and also greener. I'm very sensitive to the issue of the funding, of course, and also of the incoherence. Now I'm going a little bit out of what I wanted to say, but because I think these are a very interesting point. To how could you use savings, of course. This is, mind you, I've been head of the budget and finance in DG ECHO for more than 7 years. And before joining this very interesting unit. And this was one of the questions that we have been asking ourselves also internally, because, you know, when we propose, or we reflect about problems, of course, we do it collectively, but then, of course, we also have to take into account what are the boundaries, the constraints. And in the European Commission, obviously, we have huge constraints. I should mention, first of all, that we have the financial regulation, which does not allow, of course, to keep savings. So basically, we can only have a certain percentage of indirect cost, and only direct costs can be covered. But then also on the side of the Commission, of course, we are under the scrutiny of the control authorities, so European Parliament, so with the Budget Control Committee, and also the Court of Auditors. But it is something that we are trying to make more flexible, and I think that there could be ways to allow not savings as such, but in any case to include them in a way that can be financed. I think the units dealing with the relation with the partner, with the financial, with the legal aspects of the humanitarian aid regulations, they are tackling this and addressing this in this very moment, of course. But I cannot obviously promise anything. Anything. In terms of why are we talking about logistics? We are talking about logistics because, as Cecile was pointing out, logistics represent a very huge share of all costs. So there is evidence, and when we were asked to look at make this more efficient back in 2019, we had to conceive a new idea, a new approach, what we call a paradigm shift of this policy. And we started doing this within the Commission, but mind you, it was not an easy walk, of course, because also when you have to propose something, you need to be convincing, you need to be convincing the others, but first of all, you need to be convinced yourself If you're not convinced yourself about the goodness that this could bring, then you will fail. You will fail. And this, so we were able to convince our hierarchy, convince the other actors around there, because there was an evidence, of course, of the inefficiencies, ineffectiveness of the system, of the supply chain system. And that is why we were looking not at something just easy results or low-hanging fruits, but we wanted to have something which was more ambitious in terms of a strategic approach to the supply chain, and not only here and there facilitating the access to the final beneficiaries, which is also important, but it is mostly a short-term objective rather than a strategic aim. I think that in terms of coordination, we have lots of initiatives and projects together. Yes, Cécile, mentioned, so with France, with the US, and of course we are very keen to work together because we think that it is true, the ECO is an important partner, but represents a very small part of the whole logistics system. And what it is important for us, it is to establish, to create this critical mass that would enable to make real changes in logistics. So I will stop here, but of course, I'm sure that I will intervene also in the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marco. And perhaps I'll jump on the point on the paradigm shift and ask you, Pierre, perhaps, why do you think it's essential that for donors to invest in supply chain and logistics? And can you highlight some of the examples of how the French government is supporting that paradigm shift that was referred to by Marco earlier?
Très bien. Bonjour à toutes et tous et merci pour l'invitation et pour le sujet qui est très intéressant, très d'actualité. Alors peut-être le premier élément à expliquer, je vais d'abord parler du centre des opérations humanitaires et de stabilisation du Quai d'Orsay. Pour deux raisons. Il a deux fonctions, si je les résume, mais d'abord venir en soutien des organisations humanitaires, les financer sur des programmes divers, dans lesquels on va avoir, ou par lesquels on a un dialogue assez régulier avec nos partenaires. Et la question logistique fait partie des discussions qui nous ramènent en disant comment on fait mieux, quoi, comment on mutualise, comment on verdit, comment quelque part on mutualise, etc. Puis il y a une deuxième fonction qui est très d'actualité, qui s'est beaucoup renforcée avec le Covid, avec l'Afghanistan, avec l'Ukraine. On est amené nous-mêmes à faire des opérations de solidarité, donc logistique d'urgence, en réponse aux États, à des demandes de différents États. Et ces dernières années, en lien avec la Commission, l'Union, l'ECO, c'est un des segments d'activité qui a aussi été amené à accroître. Et donc c'est intéressant parce que de façon très détaillée, on voit bien comment on fait pour faire une opération logistique de solidarité française en réponse à des États qui vont avoir des demandes variées dans des champs, des secteurs, etc. Pourquoi je dis ces deux éléments, c'est que ça explique aussi le positionnement de la France au cours de la dernier forum et dans le cadre de la PFUE française il y a un an, où il y a eu deux éléments qui sont ressortis, qui étaient l'appui à la capacité européenne qui était en train de se développer, qui venait compléter d'autres dispositifs de la DG ECO. Alors je pense au MPCU, mais qui est un élément particulier, mais il y a d'autres éléments. Et puis la déclaration des bailleurs sur le climat et l'humanitaire. Sur les deux sujets, on a depuis un an beaucoup travaillé. Alors ça a été souvent à l'initiative des organisations partenaires du ministère qui ont décidé, on a initié en France un groupe de travail sur le climat et humanitaire qui a beaucoup bénéficié dans le dialogue qu'on a pu avoir avec la DG ECO. Et puis autour des questions de supply chain, assez rapidement, il y avait le ex-RLH, donc Réseau Humanitaire Logistique, ou Logistique Humanitaire, qui est devenu HULO. Et dans le cadre d'un fonds innovation humanitaire, on a décidé bon, il y a eu différents projets, mais notamment celui-là, de venir en appui avec cette initiative qui correspondait à une demande des acteurs pour mutualiser quelque part, être une sorte d'ensemblier de ressources et essayer de mieux faire sur la chaîne logistique. Alors la chaîne logistique, c'est quoi, hein? Ça part de beaucoup de choses, hein. Il y a des questions d'achat, il y a des questions d'appel d'offres, il y a des questions de stock, il y a des questions, on pourrait rentrer par différentes dynamiques. L'Union européenne a été très moteur. Alors on a eu des discussions sur comment faire, et donc ça a abouti aujourd'hui à même assumer des financements directs en lien avec la DG ECO pour venir en appui à Hulot, hein, parce qu'on estime que le dispositif ou la coopérative qui est proposée va permettre aux organisations de mieux faire, donc d'être plus efficaces. Je garderai quand même simplement que bon, améliorer la chaîne logistique, c'est une question d'efficacité, certes pour les organisations, mais je dirais jusqu'au dernier kilomètre dans la délivrance de l'aide aux bénéficiaires. Voilà. Et puis après, je vais vous donner deux exemples récents en lien avec ce qui a été mis en place avec l'Union européenne. Le séisme en Turquie, en Syrie, très rapidement. Bon, il y a bien sûr le mécanisme du MPCU qui permet à des opérations qu'on peut organiser de bénéficier de prise en charge, en fin de compte, des coûts de transport. Mais il y a surtout la relation qu'avait la DG ECO avec l'OIM qui était basée à Gaziantep. Je vous donnerai un exemple. On a été amené à faire un approvisionnement. Il a atterri sur l'aéroport localement. L'OIM l'a pris en charge. 24 heures après, il était dans le nord-ouest syrien, donné à 2 organisations partenaires. Ça s'est passé en 24 heures. J'exagère un petit peu, mais une fois qu'il est arrivé sur la zone turque, c'est ce qui s'est passé. C'est une dynamique de mise en commun d'efforts logistiques très efficace. Le deuxième élément qui est très d'actualité, c'est quelque part le rôle d'ensemblier de la DG ECO avec Hulot pour sonder les ONG, pour savoir s'il y a un besoin d'approvisionnement vers Goma, donc comment est-ce qu'il y a eu une utilité à mettre en place un pont humanitaire sous l'égide de l'Union européenne, la DG ECO, en lien avec la France. C'est en cours. On en est, je crois, au 3e vol. Il y en aura un 4e. Et donc, on est sur des éléments très, très effectifs, en fin de compte, de rationalisation, de mise en commun, de partenariat, quand même, entre toutes voilà, ces différentes unités. Donc voilà, pourquoi on participe? C'est bien pour tous ces éléments. C'est très dans l'idée d'être sur des réponses rapides, efficaces, en réponse aux besoins de terrain et de ce que font remonter les organisations non gouvernementales ou les partenaires humanitaires avec lesquels on travaille, et dans un partenariat qui ne cesse de se renforcer avec la DG ECO et tout l'écosystème. Donc c'est gage d'efficacité, d'efficience, je ne sais pas comment on le formuler, il n'y a peut-être pas de bon mot là-dessus, mais donc pour répondre à la question, c'est ce que je pourrais vous dire aujourd'hui.
Merci infiniment, Pierre. Et vous n'exagérez pas, j'étais à la frontière puisque le cluster logistique facilitait les opérations de transfert à la frontière entre la Turquie et la Syrie. Et vous n'exagérez pas, ça s'est fait en peut-être 24 heures ou 48 heures entre la France, le concours d'éco et le passage à la frontière avec les camions d'IOM. Donc très très efficace, en tout cas sur cette réponse-là. Nadia, I'm going to come to you and perhaps broaden a bit some of the topics and the questions. So when we're talking about supply chain optimization, efficiency, we can talk about anticipating crises, about preparing the humanitarians, equipping the local actors, the national governments, promoting greener supply chain practices in general. But also improving data sharing, investing in new technologies. I think Cécile referred to innovation earlier, and ensure that donors also have common approaches, as we just saw with France and the European Union. So these are all essential priorities to move forward. What do you think that donors should focus on in the coming years, and how? And same as I asked all the panelists, do you have a few examples, concrete examples, and in terms of what we can do and the impact that you can see with that change?
Thank you, Malin. It is wonderful to be here, and it is wonderful to know that supply chain logistics are in the forefront and are constantly being discussed as a priority. In USA's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance Supply Chain Division, we focus on a few key points to prepare and to respond to potential crisis. We see those as our current priorities, and we constantly discuss those with our regional colleagues as well as our partners. One of the common themes that don't seem to go away are our stocks and preparedness efforts related to stockpiles. We currently maintain food warehouses in several locations around the world, as well as the non-food warehouses in Miami and Dubai. It is an important point because this is something that's discussed across the donor community as well as partners, and while it is seen in many cases as a last resort, it is tapped into, and what we've noticed over the past few years is that the need for those commodities has been increasing, in part because some of the local markets have been affected by the ongoing crisis. We attempt to understand as much as we can the partner needs and technical requirements in the preparedness phase. And then it's important that we're able to deploy those stocks, those typical commodities used in the humanitarian response, tarps, the kitchen sets, blankets, and other common items as quickly as possible. More recently, and specifically Haiti a few months ago, we were, in addition to deploying our own stocks, able to support partners in providing the air bridge to deliver those commodities. We also think that, and Malin, this is bringing back your introduction, it is important that our logistics colleagues are able to plan projects in advance and be part of the project planning on much earlier stages, specifically, ideally before the project is funded. In our guidelines, we ask partners to think about how they're going to plan procurement, transport, warehousing for those projects. We understand that in critical situations right after the emergency, some of this information might not be available. However, we ask to find as much of it as possible. And we've had this approach for several years in supply chain, and we look forward to working more with other donor colleagues and finding the same approach, as we think for partners, for humanitarian partners, it would be a lot easier if our approach to supply chain and supply chain requirements has some common ground. There will always be some other areas where common ground is more complicated, and silly, I'm thinking about the pharmaceuticals that you mentioned before. However, for many other items, there is probably a possibility of finding common grounds in how we approach the supply chain, and specifically involving logisticians into the projects before as they are being conceived. The greener supply chains are extremely important to us, and I think to others as well in this panel and beyond. Having worked with several partners, we've discovered that for some partners are quite familiar and introduced a lot of greener approaches to supply chains, while others are still learning what the best options could be. So to support our partners, we look at possible resources, and some of these are already available. We made a few suggestions, and we see partners really taking these and implementing those. And these could include things like looking at more environmentally sensitive packaging, reducing plastic and packaging of our commodities, using more sustainable warehouse practices, and reducing waste management, having waste management plans in place. We'll look at taking measures to select transportation mechanisms and vehicles and generators that have lesser carbon emissions, and of course reducing the life cycle of the vehicles, because some of them are used to the point where they're really not efficient and effective and really don't contribute positively to the environment. There are quite a few other initiatives that we support that includes the environmental sustainability and humanitarian logistics project led by the Global Logistics Cluster. It's through the joint initiative. This project has been supported now for quite a while and continues to be. It's an important initiative. And among other things, it looks into incorporate the data found through this project into LogAI platform and shared more broadly with the humanitarian community. We think that sharing data in disaster preparedness and after the emergency is critical. Of course, REC that I've just mentioned is one of those possibilities, but there are other efforts such as LogAI itself that supports our partners and allows partners to have access to very important critical logistics data right after the emergency, seeing it visually on the map and knowing what happens where. We see that we see the increased need for the common supply chain efforts. We've always recognized that the common transport and warehousing efforts are something that can be used and should be used, especially when the resources are scarce. But we're now seeing those efforts incorporated in the procurement as well through the humanitarian logistics cooperative ULO, and that supply chain division has begun supporting at the end of 2022. We hope that this platform not only allows to pulling the resources together, but also allows local organizations to have access to this platform and simplify their efforts in procurement specifically. Many of these initiatives are ongoing, some at different stages. But we also rely on our humanitarian partners to hear more of what we can do to support our supply chain efforts. And we definitely want to hear your thoughts here or beyond this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much for turning that back to the humanitarian. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I saw also that, Cécile, you were taking quite a few notes, so I'm sure you want to react to some of the colleagues' interventions.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. No, I just want to, hearing you, I want to highlight, it's true that the donors have done an incredible effort over time to explain also that supply chain is a strategic partner and the one delivering aid. And Marco, you talk about paradigm shift. Your log policy starts actually saying supply chain is a critical partner, and it was also taking a stand in that. And for me as well, I realized since COVID, it's a new world. I mean, in COVID, if you remember, there was a very difficult time. No plane were flying, standstill. And I remember this feeling that we had stock all over the world that couldn't move, right? And going to ECHO and saying, look, why don't we do these crazy things of taking people from our own NGO and doing an air bridge? I mean, never done before, never funded before. Let's try to make the impossible possible. And we did it together, right? Thinking outside the box with the French government and doing something new. And for me, that was also a new message that working better together, we can overcome some of the pain points that I mentioned earlier. I think it's a new world. I don't know if you hear this term, we hear a lot now, it's a VUCA world. I don't know if you have heard it before. We talk about vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that's this VUCA world where we need agility. We need to be agile in supply chain, we need to be faster, we need to be more efficient. But sometimes we are still blocked in this very restrictive funding mechanism. But it's not like your problem, it's our problem. And the same that we have done with the air bridge, the same that you have been supporting this new ULO initiative, I think we need to sit together and define a new future of how we can maximize your grant investment. Because it's about maximizing every dollar you spend through an NGO to impact people, right? So that's my point, that it's not like separate problem. We have to work as partners together, like during COVID, in this new world, to break the barriers and find solutions. So that would be my point. Let's sit together and find how we can maximize your investment.
Then Marco, if I may ask you to react on this, and you spoke already about the funding flexibility, we spoke about reinvesting the savings that humanitarian can do as they are encouraged to do better. But, you know, we need also to talk about earmarking. We need to look at how we can get better in this VUCA world, while at the same time keeping the transparency that is required of us as humanitarians, but while ensuring that we reduce the burden of the bureaucracy, of the heavy controls, which we understand is needed. So can you react to perhaps what Cécile just mentioned and give us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, first react to what Cécile was saying. I'm very grateful to Cécile for having mentioned this very important initiative, basically, this air bridge, which then led to the creation of this new initiative, so the EHRC, so the European Humanitarian Response Capacity, which is partly basically a consolidation of existing actions, projects like the EcoFlight, for instance, which has been there for many years in some African countries, but some other parts are rather innovative. So the air bridge is one of them. And if I would also, there will be, by the way, a session this afternoon where my director, Hans Das, is one of the panelists. They're very important because it will be about cooperation and not duplication among the existing instruments, including civil protection actions. So I believe that this humanitarian bridge indeed is something innovative. It's basically thinking out of the box. And the idea of the innovation is also very important in our proposal for the new logistics policy. And basically, we also have funding for innovation. So basically, we have our own humanitarian implementation plan for humanitarian logistics with 8 million for 2023. So we support regional, country, and global projects. And one of the key aspects should also be innovation. So basically, how we can have innovative approach in the supply chain area. I think what was so I wanted to react also to your question was about the earmarking funding.
Earmarking and all the perceived lack of flexibility from the funding side, and at the same time the requirement of transparency and the heavy controls.
Yeah, sure. So basically, this is part of the quid pro quo in the grand bargain, of course, between donors and the implementers. DG ECHO and the Commission overall is quite active in promoting some of the strengths of the grand bargain, and obviously transparency. More transparency should also be in line with requirements of accountability, of course. So this is very important. There is a unit in DG ECHO, as you may know, which is dealing with strategic partnerships. And this is about basically trying to provide more certainty about the funding available for a given year. So it's linked also to multi-annual funding, which is also a very important element. But we all know that the cake is the same, or even maybe shrinking at times, with a big crisis, which are protracted crisis, and needs funding for many years, and therefore the share, which is not to mention some specificities which should also be considered when you talk about funding. For instance, education in emergencies, which is a very important flagship for DG ECHO. Also the forgotten crisis, also very important. Therefore, it is very important that the money that we have is used properly and efficiently. And because the money is limited, and indeed the best we can make use of this money is the better.
Thank you, Marco. And I'll turn to Pierre perhaps with a question that we haven't touched upon, but which is equally important, which is access, and the role of high-level advocacy and diplomacy to ensure the access to the supply chain and the logisticians to be able to do their job. So that piece we haven't touched upon. I just wanted to know if you could give us your thoughts on this.
Alors, je ne sais pas comment, comment je vais répondre. Peut-être une partie de la réponse est, excuse-moi, mais je voulais parler un petit peu de la question de la localisation autour de supply chain, parce que c'est un sujet que les acteurs nous ramènent, mais que nous-mêmes on découvre dans les opérations logistiques qu'on est amené à faire à la demande des États. Ça pose la question des stocks, de leur localisation. Nous, on a fait le pari depuis plusieurs années, parce que c'est un partenaire, de travailler beaucoup avec nos collègues de la Croix-Rouge française, qui ont mis en place plusieurs dispositifs. Je pense à la Piroie à La Réunion, il y a la Pirac dans les Caraïbes, et puis surtout qui bénéficient du réseau des sociétés nationales de la Croix-Rouge, donc sur lequel on s'appuie, ils s'appuient pour mettre en œuvre, mais c'est bien une manière d'essayer de projeter à la fois des équipements, du personnel, des formations dans des situations de catastrophe. Et de la même manière, on a tiré un certain nombre de conséquences, c'est-à-dire que nous-mêmes, on a un certain nombre de stocks, donc il y a Paris, certes, mais régionalisés. Alors pourquoi je veux parler de ça, c'est que quand même ça se passe d'abord et avant tout au plus proche des crises. La supply chain pourrait laisser penser que tout vient de l'extérieur, etc., alors que ce n'est pas du tout, c'est une partie de la réponse, mais pas uniquement. La question de la collaboration avec les zones de stockage des Nations Unies, les grosses agences, est centrale, notamment les collaborations avec différents bailleurs ou États sur la façon de ne pas faire de doublons en fin de compte et d'avoir des capacités communes de travailler ensemble. Et puis l'autre élément que je voulais souligner, c'est la question des partenariats, parce que c'est un élément important autour de Hulot, mais c'est un élément qui est central pour nous, c'est-à-dire que nous, à la fois au niveau du ministère des Affaires étrangères, de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères, on travaille beaucoup déjà en interministériel sur des opérations de sécurité civile en particulier, ou qui vont mobiliser les moyens de l'État. On va avoir le ministère de l'Intérieur, on va avoir le ministère des Armées pour des questions de transport, on va avoir le ministère de la Santé, beaucoup, dans le cadre notamment de la réponse au Covid, avec des donations diverses et variées. Et puis derrière, on a un certain nombre de fondations, alors dans le domaine des transports, mais pas uniquement. On a vu dans les dernières opérations, ou ces 2 dernières années, la Fondation Airbus, la Fondation CMA-CGM. On a travaillé au moment du Covid avec Air Liquide sur des questions d'oxygène. Il y a une capacité, c'est-à-dire en facial, on va avoir une activité qui va avoir un coût financier. Et puis, si on valorise les dons en nature et les prestations gratuites, on multiplie peut-être par 2 les activités qui ont été déployées. Donc c'est très intéressant parce que c'est bien de l'économie de moyens. C'est bien le fait de pooler ensemble des capacités et de faire que, au final, on fasse mieux. Voilà, ça a été le cas dans l'opération sur la Turquie, notamment avec des appuis de fondations diverses. Donc voilà. Et puis peut-être le 3e point, j'élargis, mais j'essaye de donner aussi des exemples. Quand même, l'opération sur l'Ukraine, elle est à la fois exceptionnelle sur la dimension de ce qui s'y passe, sur l'action des ONG et sur les opérations d'État à État, en lien avec la DG ECO, les différents hubs qui ont été mis en place tout autour, je dirais, de la crise. C'est phénoménal, les opérations logistiques qui ont été menées, les approvisionnements, la récupération par les autorités ukrainiennes, et puis ces lignes de vie, en fin de compte, qui sont déployées ici par les organisations, là par l'État ukrainien lui-même, pour arriver au plus proche des communautés qui sont... Je pense que ça, par rapport à des crises équivalentes, je ne sais pas s'il y a quelque chose d'aussi comparable en termes d'efforts logistiques global au niveau humanitaire dans ce qui a été engagé. Et c'est bien là aussi un maillage de partenariats divers. Ici, ça rentre par l'État, là, ça rentre par les organisations non gouvernementales, et voilà. Et sans parler des initiatives citoyennes variées qui sont parties de collectivités avec des dons organisés souvent sous l'égide d'un certain nombre d'organisations non gouvernementales, mais pas uniquement. Voilà, donc je suis parti peut-être un petit peu dans tous les sens. C'est aussi pour alimenter la photographie.
Le débat, non, parfait. Merci. Conscious of time, I'll probably move to questions from the floor for you. I think that one of the colleagues is here with a microphone, so if there are any questions from the floor, please do raise your hands. Otherwise, I will move on to, there's one here, and then if I may ask also if we can have the slide of questions. Yes, they're coming up. Thank you very much. If you may introduce yourself and your organization.
Certainly, thanks very much. My name is Esko, I'm working with Plan International. I have a question about flexibility and compliance. One thing that we often face is balancing acts between, on one hand, safety and compliance, and on the other, between speed and flexibility. At the same time, we emphasize the importance of localization, support the local economies, and sustainability. And one thing that in the field often comes up as an obstacle here is the, let's say, the bureaucracy that prevents us from supporting unregistered entities, such as local civil society organizations and, say, local farmers associations. And I'm curious to hear, when it comes to the developments that we're facing in flexible supply chain, if there are any initiatives that we've undertaken or are looking at that would allow us to more flexibly support these kinds of unregistered entities. Thanks very much.
That's a very interesting one. I don't know who would like to pick that one up. It's a complex one, definitely. Anybody wants to volunteer to respond to that?
Well, we are in the same NGO, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from. So it's more, I mean, it's a question, it's a large, broad question where there is a donor side and a supply chain side. But yes, at Plan International, we spend more than 100 million through partner every year. And then we have all kinds of partners. We have the small communities, we have partners which are more subcontractor, we have government. And I always say sometimes it's a challenge in supply chain because it will be like having one factory delivering, you know, yogurt, printers, and something totally different. So, but within our own NGO, what I say is, for me, this partnership have a strong need for capacity building from our NGO to partners. So these partners sometimes have to manage complex supply chain, and we sub-grant. But then sometimes we double the annual revenue, right? And I'm like, that's hard to be able to have such, how do you say, competency development in such a short time. So I'm always saying, from our country office, we need to build capacity. We need to stand alongside them, help them grow. It's not a sub-grant, it's a partnership. So we need to have our own capacity internally funded, to be able to work alongside the partner, as sometimes people in our own office don't have enough time. You know, we have 40 partners in the country, they already have to run plan logistics or supply chain. So I'm saying add people that will support them, and then be able to adapt the type of support depending on the type of partner, because everyone needs different support. So it's more my side of the story, while we're looking forward to yours.
Very much to the preparedness effort, the preparedness of the local government, the national entities, the local partners, the communities, and how do we build that preparedness way ahead of time to respond better and reduce our costs better. So Marco, go ahead.
Thank you. So I don't have a precise answer to your question, but I can mention that, of course, when we decided to create the EHRC, so this is exactly to facilitate the last mile delivery, to provide assistance whenever some goals cannot be achieved with the normal, with the standard means. And just for your information, we have also quite a number of conversations with potential partners that even in the private sector that can help us in different types of activities. We had a meeting last week, a conversation with a big logistics private company I will not mention which one, but and they will continue this conversation, and they were proposing some services which might indeed be interesting. For instance, facilitating the work in the airports, for instance, because when staff and people come to an airport, when there is an emergency, etc., all the people crisis. So this and there, I think these are elements which are very important, and basically, if it can be facilitated, it is very good for the overall system. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think there was a little piece that was missing for the answer, which is how to enable those organizations that are not registered. And I think that's where the pooling of resources, getting together as a community and helping each other. The example that you gave about France taking IOM, who was already established in Turkey, to receive the goods and to be able to redispatch them. All of this was done as a global coordination and pooling of resources to enable those who have the capacity to help those who may not have that capacity or that registration in that case, if I may. I see another hand up over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Reverend John from South Sudan. I work for Africa Development Aid. It's a very interesting discussion talking about the logistics and supply chains. When it comes to the localizations and reducing the burdens of big suppliers and giving it to the local context. We work with the Food Fund in South Sudan, and when you look at the way supply chains is actually working, is given to the big agencies like the UN. When are we going, when is the donors going to give supply chains to the local partners? When it comes to the implementations in all the areas, we work with IOM in South Sudan. My organization work with IOM. I have a staff sitting at the IOM in South Sudan in responding to all the emergencies. But when it comes to procurements, we are not seeing, because there are so many things that the local need, but the international community or the big NGOs do not know about. Sometime I will give an example. We used to actually distribute the saucepans and I don't know which country produced this thing. When women cook, you see the old food, the saucepan break down. And until one of the commissioner contact me and say, John, you need to talk to your donors, because now the food that maybe it may be the last food for the family, and when it is almost coming to cooking and becoming okay for the family to eat, now the saucepan, and then now it's because of the local context, because we don't know what the people need. So when are we localizing it down? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this question. I think, if I may, Nadia, will invite you to give your insights on this one.
Sure. Thank you, Milan. And I think that, well, when, hopefully now, in the short answer of when, I think that at least from the BHA's perspective, we're definitely looking at the localization and having to be able to work closer with the local organizations directly. From the supply chain point of view, however, this is a particularly interesting point because the local organizations have the familiarity with the not only local communities, but also local markets, and like you said in your question, the needs of what's required. So I think, again, going back to the supply chain, we're looking at different types of resources and capacity, and ULO's efforts could be one in pulling the resources and also setting up these platforms, but there could potentially be other efforts in us supporting the local organizations so that they do have access, well, they already have access to the local markets, but also can go beyond that. I think in understanding how some of the local organizations operate from the supply chain point of view, we have to look at sometimes at them as at the supply chain, not as only as a service provision, but also as the programmatic objective of how to develop it. And that, I think, goes back to your question earlier on the unregistered partnerships with unregistered organizations and associations. If we see them as already capable of delivering the service and being able to manage the supply chain, that's wonderful. But if that's not a case, then we really have to put supply chain as the programmatic objective. And for BHA, in our guidelines for our NGO partners, we have logistics sector as one of the sectors that we see as a viable one, and it's been there for several years, where we do support the procurement, transport, and warehousing as a programmatic objective, not as a service only. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I saw one more hand up. I think we have time for one more question, and then I would move to some of the Slido questions.
Thank you. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question. Nicholas from Finland's Ministry for Foreign Affairs. One of our important objectives is supporting organizations of persons with disabilities, but also from the perspective of mainstreaming gender and supporting women-led organizations. I think it's just building a little bit on Esko's earlier comment and the comment made by BHA. Often these are organizations that can't be subcontractors. They don't have the capacity for that. And then I know that the UN at least is looking quite a lot at whether they could be service providers. So purchasing that service from them, whether it's trainings or assessments or studies and things like that. It's niche for looking at the overall supply chain, but it's something that would have a huge impact. So also inviting you to look at how that could be facilitated and the conditions for purchasing these types of services, which is a very specific type of procurement. So it's not a question as such, but more of a comment or invitation to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this and very relevant point. Cécile, you wanted to react to this?
No, but just one example about how we do it for PLAN. It doesn't cover people with disabilities, but it's still an example. I don't think donors prevent us to work with local organizations, but I do hear that sometimes they are not at level to be able even to respond to a tender. So what we have done at PLAN International is this gender-responsive procurement, when we partner with UN Women to find a woman-owned business in our supplier database and work closer with them. And for this organization who are not there yet to be able to respond to a tender, we work alongside them with our own capacity, and we partner with the Cherry Blair Foundation, who is promoting women management, women procurement knowledge. So we have this dual approach, but it's a choice. We want to promote gender, and we want to promote this woman-owned business because they have an impact on the local economies, local communities. But it's an extra effort within the NGO to be able to find them, to support them, and enable them to grow as well. So it requires something within the NGO as well, this strategic decision to say sometimes it will take longer, it will cost more, but this investment has a direct impact on the local economy and an impact on the country in the long term.
Thank you very much, Cécile. I look at the time and I see that we are almost at the end of our session. I wanted to take a couple of questions from the Slido, which we have in front of us. The first one, logistics supply chain should be paired up with domestic legal regulations to avoid bureaucratic-related bottlenecks. Where do we stand in this regard? So I would tend to go towards, and that relates, by the way, to to my previous point on diplomacy and what other efforts are donors doing to help make that link between the international humanitarian assistance and the governments that are receiving the assistance. It links to preparedness. What are we doing in this regard? May I ask, I don't know, Marco, Pierre, would you like to react to this? Pierre?
Alors, je ne suis pas un grand spécialiste de la logistique, mais on voit bien que pour intervenir, les organisations ont affaire à des autorités locales avec lesquelles elles sont en interaction. Donc, c'est compliqué pour moi de répondre parce que j'ai peur de dire une bêtise, mais c'est vrai que nous, on s'appuie beaucoup sur l'expertise des organisations. Elles sont toutes cartographiées, et par ce principe, cartographiées, c'est-à-dire c'est une sorte de matrice maîtrise des risques dans différents domaines, et de fait, pour celles qui sont engagées dans les questions logistiques, on sait que leur expertise leur permet, dans des environnements fragiles, de travailler dans un format qui correspond à un minimum de standards permettant à la fois d'interagir avec les fournisseurs locaux, les autorités locales, etc. Donc il y a différents processus de ce type. On a été sollicité, si je prends l'exemple de l'Ukraine, sur des questions de visa à un moment donné. Alors ça paraît peut-être un peu loin de la logistique, mais ça n'en est pas vraiment, parce que c'est une question aussi d'appui des personnels et tout ça. Donc je ne sais pas comment répondre à cette question. Je renvoie beaucoup vers les organisations parce qu'elles ont une expertise forte, et quand elles ont des difficultés qui peuvent être de l'ordre de contraintes de terrain qui leur sont imposées, logiquement elles nous en parlent, et puis on essaye, soit en lien avec soit nos différentes ambassades, soit avec d'autres partenaires, je pense à la DG ECO, de trouver des solutions. Voilà ce que je peux en dire. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à la question, mais c'est pas grave.
And I might want to add, perhaps somebody would like to pick up on the role of the impact working group in terms of importation. Nadia, maybe you want to say a word on that is related to this question?
Sure. I think impact has been a really important initiative in understanding what the current customs-related requirements are across the world in different countries, in emergency and beyond, because it varies sometimes and changes quickly as well as negotiating customs access when in terms of the commodities that may have not been allowed in regular terms but would be allowed in terms of crisis. This initiative definitely today allows us to see what can we do and what the regulations are. At the end, the host country does set these up, and we do have to be respectful. I think for me, it's a challenge to look at them as bottlenecks only, because the host government does have the right to set up those regulations. It is their customs procedures, and there is some space in negotiating, but there is also that impact has been taken on board, but there's also space in at the very least attempting to follow the procedures and understanding why these are in place and managing these to the extent possible, because some of them do have a reason to be in place.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And with the permission of the organizers, since we started a few minutes later, we'll take the last question on the Slido, which I think is an important one. Is there a similarity between the One UN approach and the ULO approach? Very good question, which I will not respond to myself, but turn to you, perhaps both on the humanitarian sector and as donors, because you have been financing both approach and supporting both approaches. And what is the difference? What is the complementarity?
Actually, I see 3 questions on ULO. I will try to do a 3-in-1 response. I think ULO is a shared services platform that aims to serve every actor, okay? NGO, local, international. We work very well with the cluster, and in the earthquake response was a good demonstration of promoting our services and working closer together. We work well with UNICEF right now, trying to access their own large private sector contract on freight forwarding and offer it to the sector. We work with Atlas Logistics, we work with Biopor. We work with every a partner and actor that have strengths in their supply chain and are willing to share it with others, but also benefit from others. So Hulot is open for everyone to participate and contribute to a shared services platform. And there is a question about the replicability of this initiative in supply chain elsewhere, so we're going to have a talk about that in the next HNPW. It's exactly the question, how can we replicate these shared services to other cluster or to other part of AIDS? So if you want an answer to the second question, stay tuned for HNPW in April.
Come to Geneva in April. Thank you very much. Would you like to react, Marco?
Not really, because I think Cécile has said it all. So no, I think, yeah, thanks.
May I ask for any final words or final reaction before we end the session?
Maybe, if I may, just to recall something that has been mentioned various times today, that when we are talking about a change, a real change in the supply chain, it is important that this is not understood as the logistics directors to act, but this is something that should be taken at a strategic level, more at managerial level. So not only project officer and up to the hierarchy. So this is very important, because the logisticians are already converted to the cause, but it is important that this is understood well by all actors, all important actors, and of course I would be happy if next year, when we have another panel, we will be able to report on the success of this policy. Over.
Thank you very much. We haven't touched on impact, but on the impact of the initiatives, but that is, I think, in everybody's mind and everybody's work plan to make sure that we continue on this. Pierre, any final words?
Non, je pensais à la même chose, c'est-à-dire que rendez-vous dans un an pour faire un état des lieux et parler du point de vue des partenaires et du terrain sur la mise en œuvre un peu des démarches de la DG ECO en lien avec Hulot comme dispositif qui, à mon avis, duquel on va aussi tirer beaucoup d'enseignements.
Thank you very much. Nadia.
Thank you. I think this discussion clearly shows that we have, as donor community, a lot in common, and we should continue discussing the current and future initiatives and common approaches to strategically position ourselves in terms of supply chain and to support our humanitarian partners the best. And I would like to also bring back the point from earlier on that beyond this forum, we're definitely interested in hearing more about your initiatives, innovative initiatives in terms of the supply chain. The more the merrier. Thank you.
And I think that's what we can retain from this conversation. It's, okay, first, there's still a lot more to do, but there's also more conversations to have from the humanitarian sector to be able to raise and to articulate what is required to make sure that supply chain is more efficient in the future. And there's also a need from the humanitarians to the donor community to make sure that on their part, on their end, there is more coordination, there is more shared approach, there is more harmonization of requirements, and so on and so forth, so that the humanitarians can get the flexibility that they require to be able to operate. With that, I would like to thank you very much. Thank you for being here today with us, and wishing you a very good end of the day. Thank you.